Today's conversation is with Jim Moray. Jim is a multi-award winning folk artist. He's also a multi-instrumentalist, a producer, and has been someone long known for innovation and for introducing new elements to folk music and bringing it to a new audience. I hope you enjoy this interview. So, hi Jim.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so how have things been?
They have been okay, really. Yeah, we've sort of, as I say, we've passed the stage of lockdown being a novelty and into the, it's a bit of a bother now.
Yeah,
but that's all right. That's only to be expected.
Yeah. I think it's really difficult because it's not like you plan this thing, and if you do like a writing retreat or something and you just go and write, I'm going to go write somewhere in the mountain in Wales and write songs and do that, that's one thing. But when you're just forced into this kind of involuntary exile, I think it's mentally it's tough as well.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have that much on live-wise over this summer, so I didn't have much cancelled. Although now we're getting into the autumn gigs being cancelled and moved, so I have lost quite a bit of stuff. But this time is always reserved for writing and recording.
Yeah.
But even then, it makes you realise how much other stuff you need outside. Even though I'm, relatively self-contained recording-wise, other musicians can't come over. There's no studios open. Even just stuff like I can't go and buy guitar strings from the shop. Yeah. So, it does make you realise what you need to make it happen, really. Yeah.
Has it been a time where you've been able to work, or have you found like that it's difficult to get motivated?
I've not been as productive as I'd have liked. When it all kicked in, I thought I was going to get loads done, but it never works like that. So yeah, I've been able to work to an extent, but it's slow progress. But then again, it's always slow progress with me. I'm sort of notoriously slow, so yeah. Well, slow and steady.
Well, I think I mean, I am as well. Not that I've anywhere close to the achievements you've made, but for me, it's not something I can force, and I work on things again and again and again, and I'm really perfectionist, and then I just delete them anyway. So,
right, sure. Well, I sympathise with that. I think also that what the hardest bit has been. I'm usually in the house on my own,
right,
and having other people in the house the whole time really sort of cramps your style recording wise, and it's partly because if you do a piano part 340 times, it's embarrassing. But that's just the process that I've ended up with, and that's the way I've been doing it for like 20 years. If there's other people overhearing it or listening in, then it's a bit awkward.
It is awkward.
But that is the way I work. So.
Yeah, I find the same. It's during this time, my wife was working from home as well, and it's just weird. I don't like singing anyway.
Right.
And to have someone hear me sing
terrible
when I'm practicing is just awful, because I get it wrong so many times. Yeah. And having someone listening is, even though she likes it, it's still I don't want to do that. So
exactly the same here.
Yeah.
But singing with other people in the house is awful.
It's weird because it's not like performing. Like, I don't mind performing live if people I know are sat in the audience. That's fine. But somehow singing at home, it's just not the same.
I think it depends on what you're used to as well. It depends on the way that you generally work. Some people are better if they've got an audience member to project song out, but you have to make. I think I have to go through all of the wrong ways of doing it before I find the right way.
Yeah. I think it comes through in your work, because it's, to me, I listen to your work, and it's this tremendous sense of detail and attention to all of the little parts of it that is there.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's very nice of you to say. I mean, I think the flip side of that is, I've been accused in the past of being too everything being being too neat, and I don't see it as neat because that's not what I hear when I listen back to it.
No.
But I think so. I mean, when I produce other people, everybody has this sort of romantic idea of, we'll get everybody together in the room and we'll do two. There's a lot of romantic ideas about the first take is always the best, and if you have to do it more than three, then you've lost the magic, man. And that doesn't tally with reality. That's right. What I'd say. It's a lovely idea.
Yeah.
But that's not the way I work, and it never has been. And I think, when I'm working with other people, I find that's not actually the way that other people work best. You need to have some spontaneity. You need to have the feeling of. But I think that the best analogy really is it's a bit like being an illusionist or something. You have to make the audience believe it's magic. Yeah. But if you start believing that the trick is self-working, it's all going to fall apart.
And if you haven't practiced it 5,000 times before,
exactly,
then,
your job is to disguise the mechanism and make it seem effortless.
Yeah, that's right. And I actually think, I've found myself sometimes you get it wrong 50 times because it's actually wrong, and then you need to rewrite or you need to do something different, and then it works.
Totally.
And I don't think that's. I'm also just not skilled enough to, quite frankly, to play it, which I'm sure is not the case with you. But
Well, no, I mean that is the case. That's the thing. That's what takes me a lot of the time. I'm not a. The thing that we say about thing that I say about false lights quite often is Sam Carter and me are very different sort of guitar players. Partly because Sam is somebody who has done a lot of practice in his life,
right?
And I'm somebody who has done a lot of thinking about music. My practice has all been sort of mental practice and listening and analysing and manipulating. But my fingers have never kept up with my brain particularly. So Sam is somebody who can play anything, and I'm somebody who can imagine anything, and that's the thing that we add together.
I think it works as well. I mean, I absolutely love the stuff you've done with False Lights, and it's very.
Thank you.
It's very different, but we're talking about you being a folk singer, and that's pretty much, I guess, because your repertoire has, and your own work at least, has been largely traditional. Yet there's. Yeah. Totally. Yet there's very little that I would say is traditional about it in the way that you perform it or in the style of it.
Well, that's a very interesting thing which I've been thinking about a lot, really, because I think we've come to a point where the idea of what traditional is has sort of broken down a bit. I think the idea of what folk is has certainly broken down a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always been on. With the idea of what folk is, it's always been on slightly shaky ground, or for as long as I've been involved anyway, it has. But we've really reached the point of it just being atomized beyond having any sort of coherent, central, shared idea, I think. But traditional is an interesting one because when I was in my 20s, I suppose you have to think about what is traditional. Is it the songs and the songs and tunes and the material, or is it the techniques and the style? And it's not so much about what you're playing; it's the way you're playing. So I think in my 20s I subscribed far more to that first idea, that these were old songs, and I was interested in singing the material in a new way. And maybe lately I've been coming round to that idea of what's traditional is the style and not the content so much. But that's obviously not the way I play, because I don't sing in that way. I don't really play with those techniques. But the thing that's, what I suppose what I'm getting at is traditional music has a sort of special status within the wider music industry, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a sort of, what they call intangible cultural heritage, but which means it's worth preserving. But what is it that's worth preserving? Is it just the songs, or is it the techniques, or is it somewhere between the two? So that has been something I've been thinking about a lot. So yeah, I mean, nearly everything I play and sing in public for sure is traditional. And I think maybe that's been a thing that I think is confusing about what I do for a lot of people, because they just can't get their heads around what it is, you know. You know, I do write a lot of songs, but I don't tend to play them in a set that contains trad stuff. I mean, aside from the obvious, you know, the obvious ones which I play all the time, just because it's a different thing, you know.
Yeah.
It's a different set of material. And I you know, the very early part of my, I always feel funny calling it a career. It always feels wrong. But the very, very early part of it, in my sort of dabbling with the wider music industry, there were lots of people who would have loved me to, you know, write songs and make something that was a bit more mainstream accessible. And having resisted it then, when all of the opportunities were there, and you know, all of the potential funding was there to do it, and all of having resisted the urge then, I think, you know, I've ploughed that trad furrow for quite a long time now.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of, you know.
It's interesting you say that, though, because, you know, I think that one of the things, and one of the most groundbreaking things about your career, let's call it that, is that you did bring a completely new and contemporary feel to it. I mean, if you think of to me, you know, first hearing Sweet England was really something like, what, how? Yeah. And then it was like, wow, this is amazing, you know.
I've only realised recently that that's a reaction that people had, because when you make something like that, when you do something like that, it doesn't get back to you. You know, for years I was really mystified with that sort of, you know, quite often attached to my name was, you know, controversial folk singer Jim Moray, or you know, he certainly ruffled a few feathers, and that never got back to me. Everybody was very nice to my face.
Yeah.
So I was always very puzzled by it. And yeah, I suppose, it's hard to have a sort of balanced perspective, I think, when we're making it.
Yeah. And I absolutely love it. And one of the things I was talking about with Nancy Kerr on our interview that we did was that how she has students now that would never have discovered this material if it hadn't been for Sweet England.
Well, I mean, that's funny because I also teach on the same course that Nancy does, and none of the students would ever say that to my face. So you know, that sort of carries on. You know, I'm unaware of that happening.
Yeah.
So it's odd. I mean, I guess I can, you know, I can understand it. I had a very different idea of what I was doing than anybody else at that point. I mean, I can sort of see bits that changed, you know, before that album and afterwards, but they're not musical things.
Yeah.
They're things like, for about 3 or 4 years, everybody had artwork that looked very similar, and you know, I didn't do the artwork, so I can say this, you know, so I'm allowed to say it, but you know, there were a lot of people who copied the artwork of Sweet England, or copied the general vibe. The vibe,
yeah.
And you know, and there was other things, but they're not musical things. You know, I do occasionally hear things where I think I know where you've got that from, but not very often. You know, I can't. It's not quite on the level of, you know, to pluck a name out of the air. Imagine being Chris Wood, right? And every English fiddle player you hear is sort of, or Andy Cutting even. Yeah. You know, I that must be incredibly frustrating. You know, or very flattering and like a very nice feeling. But you know what I mean? I don't hear people who sound like me everywhere. Yeah. So I don't. So that's not the impact that I've had, I think. But maybe people started thinking a bit more ambitiously about what they want to do.
I think it comes back to what you were saying about that it's kind of, the idea of traditional has broken down, and I think you've kind of been at the vanguard of helping that. And you mentioned that you...
Well, I don't know, because in some, if that's the case, I sort of regret that. You know, the last couple of years I've felt very like, I always felt like what I was doing was a sort of alternative to what mainstream folk was. And then I suppose now everything is alternative to the point where there is no mainstream stuff. You know, when I started playing, there was a very strong English trad, you know, the beginnings of a very strong English trad scene. So you had people like Nancy Kerr and Eliza Carthy. You obviously had Kate Rusby in a certain sort of way of presenting English folk. John Spies and John Bowden were just starting around the same time. You know, all of the festivals were headlined by Waterson Carthy.
Right.
But there was a very strong, progressive-looking but acoustic, you know... And also, I think there was a big movement of trying to find a positive English nationalism.
Yeah.
You know, the Scottish folk scene was very strong. The Irish folk scene has always been very strong. And it was a time when English folk music had been sort of under the radar. And, you know, the trailblazers in that way were Nancy and Eliza and you know, and obviously Waterson Carthy, extended family. But, you know, that doesn't exist now. There aren't very prominent people playing English, you know, very straight ahead English trad in a, you know, I can name all of the people, but they're not the ones out there headlining all the festivals.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that leaves me feeling like as I say, I always felt like what I was doing was an alternative that complemented this sort of strong core idea of what traditional music sounds like. But it feels like a lot of the audience don't actually have a picture of what traditional music sounds like anymore, because everybody is doing something that is experimenting with the form. But you know, in order to experiment with the form, we need to have a clear idea of what it actually is.
Yeah.
So that has been bothering me.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. They're not headlining the festivals, but I do think there's a really good bedrock of people who do still do that. You know, there are people who like Piers Corley, who just performs the traditional ballads and traditional songs in unaccompanied as they would be. There's people like Jackie Oates, you know, who's fantastic and really kind of grounded in that very traditional style.
Yeah, maybe you could say that.
Well, she has all that. I mean, she has that wonderful ability to do all that kind of ornamentation, which I definitely can't do. But I think, you know, I think that I was talking to Iona Fyfe, and one of the things she said, I said, well, I think there's a really kind of a Scottish folk revival going on at the moment. And she took issue with the word revival, and she said, I much better to describe it as this kind of current flow that ebbs and flows. And right now there's a flow, and you know, but it never really goes away. And there are people who are doing it. It just isn't the most popular thing at the moment.
Yeah, it's a continuation.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose it probably always feels a little bit like that. I don't feel that there's any... Well, obviously, no, there's not a particular English folk revival at the moment. I used to have a manager who said very often about, like, it's just a pendulum, and and it swings back and forth, and sometimes it'll be pointing away from you, and sometimes you'll be in the focus of the laser beam, you know. So you've just got to wait it out, really. Yeah. But you know, I think there is, you know, obviously, I believe there's a lot of English traditional music, and I think it has a role in, you know, it's something that's worth singing and worth playing and worth reevaluating every so often.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe English music is going through a bit of a fallow period, which is necessary in order to be rejuvenated.
Yeah,
you know,
that's right.
And there are some brilliant. I'm going to be patronising and say younger people, which feels ridiculous for me to say. But you know, there are people younger than me who are doing, like, whose work I love and who are doing great things with it. But they're not sort of finding the limelight just yet.
Yeah, I think it'll come. You know, I'm clearly a lot older than you are, and so I think I'm within my rights to talk about young people. The
thing with that is because most people heard of me. You know, most people found out. Sorry, I'm going to start that sentence again. most people found out about me when I was like 20, 21. So I think to a large segment of people, I'll always be 21.
That young lad, yeah.
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 So you know, I.
But you know,
like the die was cast a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. But you know, there's this thing about nostalgia, you know, that comes up, and I've discussed this previously with people, that you know, this idea that you get stuck in time, you know, with what you hear at a certain time, and I think that the same goes for festival bookers. They know the big names will draw, you know, and as much as I love those people, you know, as much as I love to hear, you know, Roger Thompson or Martin Carthy or something, it is also, there's a little bit of that nostalgia there that I think that prevents them really looking and driving forward.
Well, but they're the ones that sell the tickets, and that's the economics of festivals. I think what happened is in the last 10 years, maybe stretching to 15 years, a lot of folk festivals expanded, and a lot of things came in, and you know, in English trad, that's largely down to Bellowhead. You know, Bellowhead came along and could draw in a bigger audience and play to a bigger stage, so the festival got a bigger stage, and they increased the capacity, and they got a bigger PA. And then who do they get the next year? Well, they've got this big stage and this big capacity, so they need to get somebody who's going to sell all those tickets. And all of a sudden, the festival that would have had Martin Carthy headlining on his own is suddenly like, well, you can't have a solo act headlining anymore, so we need to. But you know, who's going to sell those tickets? Well, there's at this point there's Seth Lakeman, there's Kate Rusby, or you get the Levelers, and then once you've got the Levelers, then it's like, oh well, you know, we need to we've sold more tickets this year, so let's do it next year, and then you get the Waterboys, and I love seeing the Levelers or the Waterboys. That's not my point.
Yeah, that's absolutely it.
My point is that it's a bit like inflation in economics. Do you know what I mean? It's infinite growth. That English folk music is a niche thing, but you know, there have been points when it's been in danger of dropping off the bottom of the bill entirely. Yeah. So,
but then there were tons of folk festivals. You know, it seemed like a few years back, at least, there was, every town had its folk festival. I mean, you know, where I was living in at the time in Weston-super-Mare, there was a folk festival. You know, and it was in every town, which was great for me. But
well, I guess those years prior to the 2008 financial crisis were sort of boom years for folk music, and we didn't realise at the time. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it was that those years were very good, and there were a lot of new folk festivals, and they had great lineups. And I think there was also a sense of purpose. You know, I remember first year Boris Johnson was Mayor of London, maybe the second year. But one of the things he did was he had a St George's Day concert in Trafalgar Square, and it was me, Seth Lakeman, Liza Carthy, Catherine Tickell, Bishi, who's British Asian sitar player, probably some more I've forgotten. I'm really sorry if you listening have played it and I've forgotten. But it was also roughly the same time as Nick Griffin from the BMP had said his favourite music was folk music. So there was a really strong. I mean, just the idea of a free open air gig in Trafalgar Square that a few thousand people went to, that was all English folk musicians, and they all had like Folk Against Fascism T-shirts or stickers on their instruments. That's amazing. That's amazing that happened, and the idea that there was this united idea of, first of all, that Boris Johnson did something for English folk music, even indirectly, and that then everybody rallied around this idea of a sort of alternative nationalism. You know, I think there was a lot of optimism that we could define what Englishness could be through folk music. Yeah. And that has all dissipated, partly because of world events, you know. Yeah. I don't know whether I would want to stand up and, I mean, even in the wider UK, and, I don't think the angle is being proud of being English right now.
Yeah, sure.
In a Brexit way, I mean,
I
like
understand.
I'm embarrassed in front of my sort of Scottish folk friends, really.
Yeah.
Not that I'm embarrassed of Englishness per se, but it feels like a steeper uphill struggle to, you know, to go waving a flag around.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I do think as well that there is always that tension, and there has been, at least for me. You know, I always kind of struggled with things like Morris dancing and so on, because it did seem to have this quality of harking back to that perfect old England, and of course then there's some blackface issues and so on. But
I think the thing with the thing with Morris dancing is it sort of got co-opted, and I think maybe it's that sort of 70s revival was a bit too successful in that it became shorthand. So, you know, the two Ronnies had a Morris Dancers sketch. It became a thing that you would have in sketch comedy.
Yeah.
You know, as shorthand. But, you know, Morris dancing in itself has a huge sort of radical history.
Yeah.
And that side didn't come across enough.
That's right.
I mean,
and I think that's generally
thing
true.
Is a whole other issue.
Yeah, but I think that's true of folk in general. And I was talking to Nancy again about this. Is that, you know, that how the fact of, you know, a lot of festivals, a lot of festival goers tend to be leaning very conservative and they're middle class and so on, and then a lot of folk singers are their politics are very left, and they're very, very blunt about it.
Yeah, but I mean, the folk scene that I started performing on, certainly, you know, I wouldn't have said that the audience was very conservative at all. I would have said it was a cozy left-wing bobble, frankly.
Yeah.
So, you know, I've never thought about it that way. And maybe it's because it's the same audience and we're 20 years later, and that thing of getting a bit more right-wing as you get older. But that said, you know, a lot of people I know have got more, you know, far more, what's the word? Strident lefties as they've got older as well. So I don't know whether that rule is as universal as it would seem. But
It's folk a political thing.
The folk scene is conservative with a small c.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have said it was a right wing voting scene.
No.
I mean, you know, maybe it is now, and it's a slow creep that I've not noticed, or maybe it's a demographic change that I've also not noticed, because, you know, as we've said, without labouring the point too much, you know, I did a lot of festivals, I did a lot of gigs last decade. You know, I've had a slower 7 or 8 years for various reasons.
Yeah,
I'm not
criticising
not as in touch with the mainstream folk scene as I used to be.
Yeah, I'm not really criticising. It's more that I think once things become more commercial, and once you get bigger and bigger, and as you say, some of these festivals got really big, then commercial interests tend to come in. Then it becomes more comfortable for, let's say, more middle class attendees, and it becomes more of a family day out. And as you say, early on in the folk clubs, it was the old socialists with, you know, flat caps. At least where I was in Sheffield and so on, which, you know, and it was all songs about miners and, you know, how bad Thatcher was and all of that stuff.
Yeah,
but, you know, that dates me. But
but I think you're right. That does date which era of the folk scene you're talking about. You know, prior to that, there was the thing that happened is you've got that. I mean, literally, the folk club movement. I mean, this is a whole other topic, but folk clubs aren't a particularly traditional thing. They're a thing that were largely invented in the late 1950s as a way of having a place to sing folk songs. But some of the architects of that movement were, you know, what's the word? Some of the architects of that movement were doing it because they were members of the Communist Party, and it was a way to try and put the songs of the people in the hands of the working people. You know, that there's some. So, you know, there was a very deliberate thing. Topic Records was started as the musical arm of the Socialist Worker Party, I think.
Yeah.
You know, so that 50s, early 60s folk club time was very strongly like that. In the 70s, you get this explosion of sort of folk club comedians, which is where you get Jasper Carrott and Billy Connolly and Mike Harding, and that's probably that's sort of what's happened, I think, in our era as well. This thing of something with a very pure, what's the word? A very, very sort of pure thrust to it. More people come in, and then obviously it gets sort of commercialized, and you know, I suppose it's a bit like a sort of breathing in and out of the whole scene,
there's
really.
definitely an ebb and flow. I talking about Billy Connolly, you know, it's interesting that people he was a comedian but also a very good musician, and but yeah, you think very, very few people have heard of Hamish Imlach, who was really the reason that Billy Connolly exists. You know, he was the traditional folk singer with an amazing sense of humor and just singing very, very funny songs with different anecdotes and so on. So yeah, there's that kind of long tradition of that. You
can see that folk clubs were a brilliant training ground for that sort of all-round entertainer.
Yeah.
You know, if you're, you know, Jasper Carrott was also, you know, not, I wouldn't say he was such a great musician, but he was very instrumental in the folk scene of, you know, he was a club organizer and an agent. You know, he was as a behind the scenes person, he was very influential before his own career took off. So I think, from what I understand, a lot of that comes from he was the organizer, and then he was the MC, and then the MCing was the comedy, and then that took off. But you know, a lot of the best. In fact, a lot of the best folk source singers were also very funny people and were entertainers and were holding court. That's what they did.
And there's still a few who've managed to combine that. I think of Bill Bailey, who's a really good example of someone who's combined the very, very funny persona with extremely good musicianship and you know, great songwriting ability. Tim Minchin's another one. Anyway, but not so much traditionally folk, but kind of those offshoots of that type of scene.
Yeah. Well, you know, musical comedians is a whole other thing.
Changing tack a little bit, you know, I wanted to come back to this idea that you know of teaching, and I've heard you. I've heard you not just because of your music, but I heard you speaking on the Old Songs podcast, which I've really enjoyed. And now I think you've done 2 episodes now, at least, that I've heard, and both of them, what it struck me is just how much you know about this topic. Was it something that when you said you recorded Sweet England when you were about 2021, had you already done that research, or was that research what you had already done, or is that something that's gone on since?
Well, I mean, research is a funny one. I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm a sort of fundamentally lazy person. So, but I am somebody who picks up knowledge that isn't of any use to real life. So when I was a kid,
I can relate.
When I was a kid, I would always be able to recite the sleeve notes of records off by heart, but not have done my maths homework. Do you know what I mean? So I've always had a brain. I've always had a brain that stores away stuff. So in some ways, this was finding a job where that might be of some use. Research. I don't know. It's hard to sort of explain what the folk scene was like in the very early 2000s, very late 90s, early 2000s. But I think it was full of that idea. You know, that idea of the folk police. The folk police will arrest me if I get the information wrong. Was a double-edged sword, because on the other hand, there were lots of people who did know a lot, right? Who were very willing to take young people to one side and tell them they got it wrong. But on the other hand, I learnt a lot from those people, and I think the audience demographic, because of what we were just discussing, has sort of changed, and in some ways it's meant that folk musicians of my age were almost scared to talk about the detail, because there was always because they were playing to an audience who knew more than them. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think that's the case anymore. So we've got this thing where sometimes the folk scene is a bit starved of the detail, and the detail is the best bit. You know, the detail is the bit that, you know, the way I see traditional music in lots of ways is it's music that you should be able to enjoy with no preconceptions, no prior knowledge, I don't want it to be music that puts people off. But once you get hooked, there's all of this added extra stuff, you know, that the way people get hooked by trad music is that they come for the catchy tunes, and then they stay because there's so much information, there's so much to learn about, and it's really interesting. But the commercial folk scene has been through a long process of almost dumbing down and trying not to scare off newcomers, thinking that any complicated stuff will scare them off. So what I like about the Old Songs podcast is it's a space to discuss stuff in great detail. But yeah, to answer your question, I've always had a brain for those sort of details, but it's stuff I've just picked up over 20 years. I mean, I've certainly got a lot wrong in my 20s. So I've never really been one for doing research. It's more for, I've been one for, I'm very grateful for all the times people took me to one side and said, actually, you got that bit wrong.
Yeah.
But musically also, for somebody who is, for somebody who did a music degree at a conservatoire and now teaches at a conservatoire, I'm also a fairly self-taught musician. I've always been somebody who works stuff out and then has to go and find out what the real name for it is. Do you know what I mean? So I think I didn't get on with education in some ways, and I think it's all because the things were being explained in a way that didn't fit with the way that I understood stuff. Yeah. So in my own teaching, I try and teach for the people who possibly aren't being spoken to. Yeah. With the way that things are usually explained. Yeah. I mean, this is going off at a tangent, but where's my water? It took me a lot of attempts to pass my driving test, right? Yeah. And when I finally passed my driving test, it was only I just got a different driving instructor out of the yellow pages or off, the internet at the time, and it was only after I passed my test that I realised that by accident I'd got an instructor who was a specialist in teaching people with Asperger's how to drive. Right. And the reason I didn't get on with driving lessons for quite often is it was being explained in a way that I thought was stupid. Yes. And expanding that thing out, I'm somebody who is, as I say, I've always figured things out for myself, and then if somebody explains it in a way that doesn't make any sense to me, I just think the whole thing is stupid and switch off. Yes. So, teaching folk music at a conservatoire is a space to try and say you could understand it like this, or you could understand it like this, or there's another way. And also, none of these things are definitive because music isn't a science like that. Yeah. But there are bits of music that are unchangeable and are just physics, are just sound and physics, and we can look at those, and then we can work out what it means, because that's the really interesting bit. Yeah. So I have a way that I understand music, but I'm always trying to look for ways that other people understand music and trying to see it other ways. Maybe. Yeah, that's what I'm interested in. Yeah. I think that comes across actually, and I mean it comes across in also in things like you talk about sleeve notes and that kind of thing. So it's nice to know a little bit about the songs and to understand where they're coming from and who they're coming from. And I'm very much the same. I actually have. For a long time, I had zero qualifications in anything whatsoever because of exactly the same problems. Exactly the same issues, and then it was that I really realised that it was exactly that I don't learn in the same way. And it's not that I'm stupid, but I learn in a different way. And actually, I think that's why I love music so much, is because it satisfies a certain level of curiosity. And I can understand it, or I can approach understanding it in whatever angle that I want to. And if I don't want to study deeply in the music theory of something, I can enjoy it on a different level or in a different way. Yeah. But if I do want to do that, then I can also become completely obsessed. For instance, I became obsessed with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen for a long time, and his graph charts and all of this kind of thing, and his the squares that he was using to try to
to write pieces, and I went down that whole rabbit hole. But then at other times I just like to listen to something and learn it by ear, because that's how I want to do it. So I think it's really important to teach like that, actually. I think that's really good.
Yeah, but you know, the really important thing about music, about any sort of music theory, is it's not a set of rules to follow. It's a way to explain what just happened. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's lots of different interpretations, and it should be a language which is reactionary rather than, what's the word? Pre-actionary.
Right.
Sorry, that's made up words. But what I mean by that is, it's what I describe as a post-act definition.
Yeah.
So it's not a way to tell you what you should do. It's a way to explain what just happened.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
To other people.
And I think that's what theory is used for as well. People think, don't. Yeah. I've heard it so many times. People say, don't study theory because it will destroy you as a musician, which is that doesn't make any sense to me, because theory is helping you understand what happened and understand a way to explain it to someone else and put it on a page. And that's
the other really big deal, is that theory is taught as almost disconnected chunks that don't affect each other. So, one of the specific modules that I teach tries to knit all of these things together and say, so for instance, rhythm and harmony and melody are quite often in theory considered as separate blocks that don't interact. But my point is, melody can only exist because it has an implied harmony underneath it. Like we can only hear things as tuneful because there is a implied harmonic movement underneath.
Right.
And similarly, melody only exists because rhythm exists on a wider sense. Otherwise, what's the longest notes you can hold and put in an order, and they don't sound like random notes. And then you reduce the spacing between them, and you have a melody. But that only exists because there is a rate of change. Harmony only exists because there is a rate of change, which is a function of rhythm. None of these things exist in isolation, and that's I think where formal music education really frustrated me, because it's like, that's not. But also, a lot of our formal music theory, you're taught things that are relevant to Western art music, that haven't really changed probably since the 1900-ish. They don't even take in Debussy, let alone taking in serialism.
Or Feldman or something.
or Feldman. And they certainly don't take in modal jazz.
Right.
So knitting all of these things together is, there's a huge space for you to knit all of these things and borrow the ideas from all sorts of disciplines. And certainly when we're teaching, folk and traditional music, there is a huge amount of work to be done where you can pick and choose from all of these disciplines. And also you don't need to be limited by folk, because there is this whole world of music to draw on.
And I do love the fact that there are a lot of people who probably don't have any formal understanding of music theory or how music works, yet are still able to make music and make great music. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think that's also some of the reason why people kind of sneer at theory a little bit, because they're, for instance, folk has very much been sort of done by an oral tradition. That said, without collectors who wrote down and notated some of those things, we wouldn't have them. We just wouldn't have those songs.
No, that's very true, and that's why they were doing it, because they thought it would die out. But music is a language, and in a lot of ways, it's the best language because it's a non-specific language. It's a language that's open to interpretation. So. I started quite young, but not as young as Tom Moore, that I work with, learnt violin by Suzuki method, or Suzuki method-ish, when he was young. So Tom has been playing since he was, before he could speak properly.
Yeah. And
what's really interesting about his work about his playing is it's so ingrained in his way of expressing himself that it is language. My partner's cousin's children, did a thing where they learnt sign language before they could speak.
Okay.
And occasionally they still do the sign for hungry involuntarily.
Uh-huh.
But I find that really fascinating,
Yeah.
that music can be a way of expressing yourself when you don't have enough actual, verbal language to speak.
Yeah.
And, hey, maybe in some ways it's a bit like imagination, that children innately have a better emotional understanding of music, but you learn it as you get older because it gets beaten out of you.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm by no means an expert. There are people who have studied this, and I haven't, but it's a topic that I find really, really fascinating.
I started studying classical guitar when I was about 7 years old.
Okay.
And I stopped fairly quickly after that, probably when I was about 12. And one of the reasons was that I really didn't progress very well, partly because I'm extremely dyspraxic, and I don't actually have the coordination to do, for instance, I can't do the alternate picking and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so what ended up happening, but I still wanted to play, and I realized that the formal way of learning wasn't going to work for me. It just wouldn't happen, and I had to figure out my own thing. So then I had a Sunday school teacher actually who said to me, "Why don't you play in Sunday school?" And so I actually learned to play guitar pretty much in church before abandoning all of that and sort of developing my own thing. And I'm still not technically in any way a good guitarist, but I have developed a voice, and it's become my language, and it's given me the ability to express myself. But now with the advent of electronic music and sampling and all of that, it's really expanded. And I think that's one of the things to sort of come full circle, I suppose, is that appealed to me in your work was that suddenly there was this. I was massively into Massive Attack really into that.
Me too. I think you can probably tell.
And then I heard your work, and I was like, wow, this is actually both of the things that I really like, because I loved folk music.
Yeah.
And it was like, but he's put these beats in there, and he's got this, and it sounds like Portishead and whatever. So that was really, really cool. And so I think sometimes opening up new horizons is something that's just hugely beneficial. And then you can analyze afterwards why and what and what, and notate it and all of that if you want to. But
yeah. But, I think it is that I'd formed my own internal language before I learnt the proper terms for it. I mean, I started piano lessons when I was 7-ish. And in hindsight, I zipped through the grades very quickly. So I'm not a great piano player, but I got my grade 8 theory when I was 8 or 9, maybe a bit later than that, but not much, And the reason I zipped through theory grades so quickly is because I'd already sort of taught myself how to do it by having a piano in the house and just sitting and plonking.
Right.
I'd worked out I'd worked out for myself how chords were constructed, and then I'd worked out for myself how they related to a key center. Okay, so this is a C chord, and which of these sets of 3 notes sounds? Oh, that set of 3 notes sounds really strongly related to this one. Well, why could that possibly be? Oh, I get it now, because this G is in this C chord, and if I move this shape up to that G, oh, there we go. Right. Okay, so what other? Oh, well, this one's got a different feel to it. Something tells me that these are the most important chords, but so I can put these together. I'd done all of that on my own.
Right. Is that how you approach music? So when I was listening again, and I've listened to it several times and hadn't listened to it for a few months actually, and then I picked it up again the other day before I knew I was interviewing you actually. Your Outlander album, which is fantastic, and
Thank
a
you.
little bit different, I guess, than
it is.
Others.
It is, and it's one that I'm. Now the dust has settled a bit. It was quite hard to make, because it was different, and it was a really different way of working.
Yeah.
But I think the reason I did it that way is partly because the album before that was called Upsetera.
Yeah.
And in some ways Upsetera was the culmination of that same idea I'd been attacking in different ways. So Sweet England, the album Low Culture and the album Skulk and etc. were sort of all the same idea but approached from different angles.
Yeah.
But with Upsetter, it was like I can't do this any better now. I've done this idea as well as I can possibly do it, so I need to do something else. So the Outlander was a bit of an attempt to do something else.
Yeah.
But maybe I need to make another 4 albums with that idea now to get it right. So there's bits that I would do differently, and there's a lot I learnt in the process.
Yeah.
But it was like starting again and not knowing what you're doing and having no roadmap.
Yeah. And you worked with some great people. That was, one of my heroes, I suppose. Hopefully he'll hear it and want to talk to me. Is Nick Hart, and I just absolutely love what he's doing with traditional song.
Yeah,
in a very traditional way. And so you worked with him.
Me too. I have to be very careful. Yeah, I have to be very careful how I phrase this because it could sound wrong, but I've spent most of my waking hours thinking about music since I was a child, and quite often, and mostly I know what people are doing. Like mostly I can. I've had a lot of practice at break. When I see somebody playing, I can quite often work out what they're doing.
Right.
And occasionally there's somebody who I see where it's like, okay, their musical understanding is far beyond my own. And it happened when I first saw Olivia Cheney sing and play. Olivia is just another level to my understanding. And it happened when I first saw Nick play.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, he's way beyond my level.
Right.
But with Nick, it's a bit like that. I mean, I'm sure he'd tell me to shut up and I'm being silly, but no, Nick is genuinely one of the best there is.
So what I was going to ask you about it really was, working with those different people, and obviously you've worked with Sam in False Lights. Does that give you a different kind of... Did it help you approach those things in a different way? Did it give you a different kind of freedom?
No, I worked with those people on that album the same as I generally work with people.
Right.
I've already decided what I want them to do.
Okay.
Which is a blessing and a curse. But the way I write stuff is generally I imagine it. It's all in my head, and then I'm hiring the best person to try and realise what I've got in my head. Sometimes it doesn't leave very much room for interpretation for them. But that's why you have to pick and choose your collaborators carefully.
Yeah.
It's not just because I want people who are really good. It's because I want people who won't be offended when I tell them what to do. I'm probably a difficult person to work with, but it was incredible to work with Josie N because obviously, if you want a female singer, you're probably not going to do any better.
I mean, world class,
just for voices. So, and I've been trying to get Josie Ann on the track for a long time. We've sung together live, but we hadn't really. I did a little bit of playing on a couple of the albums that she did with Ben, but I've been trying to find opportunities to sing with Josie Ann for years. Nick Hart, I used him on some stuff I produced a while ago. Which did come out, but I hired him for a studio session for another project. But I've been sort of looking for opportunities to, and he works a lot with Tom Moore, who I work a lot with. So he's sort of in our circle. But I'm always looking for reasons to have Nick on stuff.
I think it's really cool because I think again it's sort of a younger generation, Jack Rutter as well, who have kind of brought this amazing feel and in a way what Nick does is really modern, but it's also this incredibly rooted in this tradition, and you would think of it as he's just singing traditional songs, and then you, as you say, you listen to it and you think, wow, this is something special.
But it's modern because it's a modern person singing it. I think quite often with traditional performers, sometimes they get either trapped in amber or you know what I mean, or they're trying to be authentic to a thing that never existed in the first place.
Right.
But Nick is just, that's sort of at the very core of what Eliza Carthy has been doing for 30 odd years.
Yeah.
She's just a modern person playing traditional music, and she's not either making many token gestures towards modernity, but she's also not pretending to be
an ancient
a ploughboy. It's modern because it's a modern person singing it.
So when you approached this, I mean, as I said, it is a bit different. When you approached it, did you want to try to do something in terms of trying to bring it back to a more traditional sound, or how were you thinking about
sound,
it?
a simpler sound for sure.
Okay.
So some of that was a consideration that there just isn't enough budget for me to have a band anymore. Upsetera, though the Upsetera tour, when I had the string section and the woodwind and, so I had 10-piece band, were the best gigs I've ever done. But you also get to this thing of like, I can only do that because I had a bit of Arts Council funding, which lasted 12 shows. So I'm just not going to be able to do that. I can't spend my own money on that. And the festivals that booked it, we had a great show, but it's beyond the means of most places. So I needed to do something that was a bit more focused around me. And what I've always done is made albums that sound, big and expansive, and then gone out and played them on my own with an acoustic guitar. And it's always been there's always a ring of it being a bit disappointing. I've been very aware of disappointing people sometimes and disappointing myself. It's quite underwhelming if you've got a big sound in your head. So I thought I'd make an album that was centered around me and the guitar.
Yeah.
Which, funnily enough, it didn't quite work out that way. One of the comments I have had is that you don't notice the guitar is there.
Well, I do.
That was the Folk Radio UK review was very much like that. It was like this guitar that you would only notice if it was taken out. But I mean, it really is that album is very centered around what I can do singing and playing simultaneously with a few things added over the top. So but I got very excited about that archtop guitar that's on the cover of it. And this idea of a sort of pre-rock and roll electric guitar sound.
Yeah.
So to me, the sound I had in my head was like based on things like T-Bone Walker.
Okay.
And not so much that Charlie Christian-y thing. But what did electric guitar sound like before rock and roll entered the picture? What would English traditional electric guitar sound like if you'd if it had no bluesisms in it? Do you know what I mean? I heard Joe Boyd, the producer Joe Boyd, talking about Richard Thompson, saying that he's a guitarist who didn't really have blues in his vocabulary so much. He had Django Reinhardt and Charlie Christian,
right,
and fiddle tunes. So what does it sound like if you're an electric guitar soloist that has those influences instead of Jimi Hendrix? Not that Richard doesn't have a big dose of Jimi Hendrix in his style.
I think he does, yeah.
But I was trying to I think I was trying to come up with an electric guitar language that draws on Martin Carthy and Nick Jones and and Martin Simpson, and that was what I got excited about.
Yeah.
And some of it was successful, some of it less successful. I'm still learning how to do it, and I think I'll attack the problem from a different angle next time. But yeah, not a more traditional sound, a different sound, for sure.
Cool. Well, I think it worked really well.
Thank you.
And I really enjoyed it, and I hope to hear a lot more from you in the future. And I hope that as things start to ease up there as well, maybe you'll find it a little bit easier as well.
I mean, it's what's the way to put it? I was already heading for a bit of a sort of career crossroads even before lockdown happened. So now all of the gigs are off the table. That's just even more so. But I'd reached a point where there was very little in the diary, and it was wide open. So I'm still sort of working out what to do. I mean, I think I said, half an hour ago now, about having ploughed that furrow of traditional music when a lot of people would have preferred me to make more mainstream albums. I don't see any direction. I don't see any reason to sort of change course now. That would be a bit, I've come this far. But that said, I am working on an album of my own songs at the moment.
Cool.
So whether it's going to come out, I don't know. But I'm sort of... I need to reinvent the wheel a little bit. I need to work out what I'm doing.
Cool.
So I don't know.
But
every couple of albums it comes to that, really.
Yeah.
It's just this is probably the biggest there's always been a direction, or there's always been some momentum that you need to keep up, and now it feels like it's completely wide open.
Cool.
So
sounds good. Well, Jim, thank you so much for spending some time with me and sharing your thoughts, and it's been really great to talk to you. So
okay.
Appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Daughter, come straight from Cappoquin, in search of Lord Gregory. Pray God I'll find him. The snow, it wets my yellow hair, and the rain falls on my skin. The baby's cold in my arms, love. Lord Gregory, let me in. Not here, henceforth can't be seen, for he's gone to bonny Scotland to bring home his new queen. So leave now these windows, and likewise this hall, or it's there in the ocean you should hide your downfall. But who will shoe my baby's foot? Love a hand, who'll tie around the waist with a long linen band, and who'll comb my baby's hair with a fine ivory comb, who'll be my baby's father till Lord Gregory comes home. Don't you remember Lord Gregory, that night in Cappoquin? We exchanged bonny handkerchiefs, and all against my will. Yours was made of purest silk, and mine was made of cloth. Yours it cost a guinea, love, but it was wondrous soft. Don't you remember Lord Gregory, that night in Cappoquin? We exchanged rings off our fingers, and all against my will. Yours was made of purest gold, and mine was made of tin. Yours it cost a guinea, love, but it was false within. And don't you remember Lord Gregory, that night in my father's hall? You stole away my maidenhead, that was worst of all. In a strange dream he saw, I dreamed the lass of Auckland was knocking at my door. Lie there, my only son, lie there and take your sleep, for it's long ago her yellow locks are floating in the deep. Sell me the black horse and likewise the grey, that I might ride my girl to find and bring her back to me. I will range your mountains and valleys so wide till I find the girl blind.